History and background of Aramaic at jesusspokearamaic.com. What does Josephus say? The language of our country. Welcome to this lesson in our series on the history and background of Aramaic. In this video lesson, we're going to take a look at what the commonly spoken language was in Israel in the 1st century AD, or what Josephus calls the language of our country. By this, Josephus meant the language that people generally spoke in Israel, that is, their language, not the language of the current foreign occupiers, the Romans, or the Hellenistic invaders who had shortly beforehand wreaked havoc under the hand of Antiochus Epiphanes, leading to the Maccabean revolt, which we will cover in another lesson. Rather, by the language of our country, Josephus meant the language spoken in Roman Judea, or 1st century Israel. So first of all, who was Josephus? Josephus was born Joseph ben Matityahu, his birth name or Hebrew name. But in AD 69 he was renamed Titus Flavius Josephus by the Roman Emperor Vespasian, who decided to keep him as a hostage and an interpreter. Josephus was a Jew who lived around 37 to 100 AD, in other words within living memory of Jesus, and an eyewitness of the events surrounding the disciples of Jesus, preaching the gospel in Israel and to the whole world. In fact, as Wikipedia says, his works provided valuable insight into 1st century Judaism and the background of early Christianity, and his works provide crucial information about the First Jewish-Roman War and also represent important literary source material for understanding the context of the Dead Sea Scrolls and late Second Temple Judaism. Josephus was born to a father of priestly descent and to a mother who claimed royal ancestry. He was therefore well educated and was a scholar as well as a historian. In fact, Josephus' works include Antiquities of the Jews, a monumental work recording the history of the Jews from the creation of the world down through to his own day, and the Jewish Wars. Josephus was the most important and well-known historian in Roman Judea, or Israel in the 1st century, as we would call it today. He carefully recorded the painful events around the destruction of the Jewish temple in AD 70 and the subsequent ransacking of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans, followed by the siege of Masada. Josephus has been criticized as perhaps being too friendly with the Romans, but his love and patriotism towards his own people, the Jews, come across clearly in his writings. If anyone is qualified to speak about this time, it was Josephus. He knew his people, he knew the country, and as a scholar and a historian, he knew the language of his country better than anyone else. So what exactly does Josephus say about the language normally spoken by Jews in the 1st century in Israel? Surely the answer to this question must be critical to an understanding of the culture in which the New Testament was born, and the culture and context in which it must be understood. Well, it's true that the documents which we have preserved of Josephus today were written hundreds of years ago in Greek. In fact, William Whiston's classic translation of 1732 from the Greek edition of Josephus was a classic book in Victorian times, and is still, even today, the version of Josephus's works that most people will be familiar with. But we would have to go to Josephus himself, rather than a late Greek copy, to discover what Josephus himself refers to as the language of our country. It is at this point that many are surprised by what Josephus actually says. In fact, Josephus is at pains to point out that he originally wrote in Aramaic, and only later did he translate his extensive writings into the Greek language. Furthermore, Josephus admits that he still could not pronounce Greek well, even after years of learning it. Even more amazingly, he says that only a few people he knew could even speak Greek, and that Greek learning was actually frowned upon by the Jews. So let us open up the pages of Josephus's classic writings and examine for ourselves the evidence presented by Josephus, or Joseph ben Matityahu, a Jew, a scholar, and the classic historian of Roman Judea. First, let us examine Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus says, "But because this work surrounded a great deal, in process of time, as usually happens to such as undertake great things, I grew weary and went on slowly, it being a large subject, and a difficult thing to translate our history into a foreign and to us unaccustomed language. All these quotes from Josephus have been taken from William Whiston's translation. Here, Josephus clearly states that Greek, into which he was translating his history, was to Jews a foreign language that they were unaccustomed to. In fact, the whole idea of translating his monumental work into Greek was to him a very daunting task, one which would take many years and which would progress only slowly, and which would be wearisome and tiring to him. But Josephus continues, "For such names are pronounced here after the manner of the Greeks, to please my readers, for our own country language does not so pronounce them." Again, Josephus emphasizes that neither he nor his countrymen actually speak Greek. He is translating names purely for the benefit of his Greek readers. He is at pains to point out that Jews emphatically do not pronounce names according to the way that Greeks do. Greek was to Josephus a foreign language, one that he had to make an effort to learn. But Josephus continues, "And I am so bold as to say, now I have so completely perfected the work I propose to myself to do, that no other person, whether he were a Jew or foreigner, had he ever so great an inclination to it, could so accurately deliver these accounts to the Greeks as is done in these books." Josephus, rightly or wrongly, says that he is the only person, Jew or foreigner, who was able to competently translate his history into Greek so accurately. This illustrates clearly just how few people, Jew or Gentile, in Roman Judea knew Greek well enough to attempt a translation. But was Josephus correct in saying that he was the only one who could attempt a task as great and burdensome as translating his work into Greek? Let him answer the question for us. "For those of my own nation freely acknowledge that I far exceed them in the learning belonging to Jews. I have also taken a great deal of pains to obtain the learning of the Greeks, and understand the elements of the Greek language, although I have so long accustomed myself to speak our own tongue that I cannot pronounce Greek with sufficient exactness." Coming from noble birth, with a priestly father and a mother descended from royalty, we have seen that Josephus was educated, intelligent, and already an acknowledged scholar. Yet even with that background, Josephus admits that he struggled to learn the Greek language. He admits that he does not speak Greek well, and that he had to go to great pains to learn it. This is because Aramaic is Josephus's mother tongue, and he has spoken Aramaic all his life. With that Aramaic background, Josephus admits that he can hardly even pronounce Greek properly. All those who, as adults, have struggled to learn a foreign language will know exactly what Josephus means. Learning the grammar and vocabulary of a foreign language is a difficult task in any century, and first-century Roman Judea was no different. Josephus proves that Greek was a foreign language to the Jews, one which they did not speak and were not familiar with. But, as we read more of Josephus's testimony, we discover that there was another reason why Josephus struggled to learn Greek. For our nation does not encourage those who learn the language of many nations. Josephus says that Jews actually discouraged learning the languages of the nations around them. This was because Jews had learned from painful, bitter history that the nations around them only caused problems and only led them away from God. Jews did not want assimilation. The Maccabean revolt was still fresh in their minds, when Greek language and culture was forced upon them by Antiochus Epiphanes, when the temple was desecrated, and Jews were forced to eat swine's flesh and worship statues of Zeus. Ever since the Maccabean victory, Jews largely rejected Greek philosophy and the Greek language, and discouraged the speaking of Greek, keeping the Maccabean revolt and subsequent victory at the front of their minds. Despite this, some Jews had succumbed to Greek learning and had allowed pagan Greek philosophy such as wisdom, devils, false ideas of heaven and hell, and so on, to enter Judaism. Some Jews had started to Hellenize Judaism and absorb ideas from the Greek pagan culture around them, and mainstream Judaism despised them for it. Those Hellenistic Jews are known in the New Testament as Grecian Jews. Acts chapter 6 verse 1 And in those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews, because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. But let us return to the subject of the language in which Josephus wrote his classic works. In his The Wars of the Jews, Josephus writes, "I have proposed to myself, for the sake of such as live under the government of the Romans, to translate those books into the Greek tongue, which I formerly composed in the language of our country." Josephus says that his works were originally written in Aramaic, the language of his country, of Roman Judea or Israel, but that he translated those works into Greek later. They were not originally written in Greek, since Josephus has already told us that he was unfamiliar with that language. The later translation into Greek was necessary because the Romans carried out a wholesale destruction of all Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts in the destruction of AD 70. Greek copies were all that remained. Josephus also draws the distinction between his histories and those of other Jews, all of which were written in Aramaic, and other historians of Judaism, which Greeks had by this time attempted. Many Jews before me have composed the histories of our ancestors very clearly, as have some of the Greeks done it also, and have translated our histories into their own tongue, and have not much mistaken the truth in their histories. In Against Apion, another of Josephus's works, Josephus also explains that his work was translated into Greek. My books of the antiquities of the Jews, those antiquities contain the history of 5,000 years, and are taken out of our sacred books, but are translated by me into the Greek tongue. In translating into Greek, Josephus testifies that he originally wrote in a language other than Greek, Aramaic in other words. And despite being a renowned scholar, Josephus even had to obtain help in learning the Greek language. Afterward, I got leisure at Rome, and when all my materials were prepared for that task, I made use of some persons to assist me in learning the Greek tongue. Thus, once Josephus was determined to translate his works into Greek, he could not at that time even speak Greek. Having, and needing, a certain amount of leisure time, he has to go to Rome to obtain assistance in learning Greek before he could begin the onerous task of translation. A lengthy journey to Rome was necessary because Greek was not spoken locally. Why did Josephus have to go to Rome? Was Greek not spoken in Alexandria in Egypt? Was the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Torah, not made in Alexandria? Was there nobody with a proficiency in Greek living in Egypt at that time who could have assisted Josephus in learning Greek and thus avoid a journey to Rome? Well, Josephus continues, "I shall begin with the writings of the Egyptians, but Manetho was a man who was by birth an Egyptian, yet had he made himself master of the Greek learning, as is very evident, for he wrote the history of his own country in the Greek tongue." So not only was Greek not spoken in Israel, but this testimony tells us that Greek was not spoken in Egypt either. Here, Manetho is an Egyptian, yet he, like Josephus, bucks the trend and decides to learn Greek. Greek, therefore, was clearly not the lingua franca or common language of Egypt, or Israel, or indeed anywhere else in the Middle East. Now, you might think that when Josephus talks about our own language, or our own tongue, or the language of our country, he means Hebrew rather than Aramaic. Well, let's examine whether that is in fact the case. In his extensive writings, Josephus is very precise in identifying when he means Hebrew or the Hebrew language, as opposed to Aramaic, which he consistently refers to as the language of our country. In fact, Josephus frequently makes the distinction between Aramaic, which is what he originally wrote in, and Hebrew. When he means Hebrew, Josephus explicitly says so, in contrast to Aramaic. Here are a few examples from the Antiquities of the Jews to illustrate this point. "And call it the Sabbath, which word denotes rest in the Hebrew tongue. This man was called Adam, which in the Hebrew tongue signifies one that is read. Now a woman is called in the Hebrew tongue Isha. He also commanded him to be called Israel, which in the Hebrew tongue signifies one that struggled with the divine angel. Now the former of those names, Gershom, in the Hebrew tongue, signifies that he was in a strange land. Adoni-Bezek, which name denotes the Lord of Bezek, for Adoni in the Hebrew tongue signifies Lord. Deborah, a certain prophetess among them, whose name in the Hebrew tongue signifies a bee. Now Barak in the Hebrew tongue signifies lightning. Now Naomi signifies in the Hebrew tongue happiness, and Mara sorrow. To a certain city called Mizpeh, which in the Hebrew tongue signifies a watchtower. Now Nabal in the Hebrew tongue signifies folly. In these examples, Josephus makes reference to these words being in Hebrew because they are all examples of words which are different to the equivalent word in Aramaic. Josephus, writing in Aramaic, gives the Hebrew word, but then has to explain what the word means to his Aramaic readers. If he had been writing in Hebrew in the first place, a translation would obviously not have been necessary. This proves that Josephus must have written in Aramaic rather than Hebrew. And so, when Josephus means Hebrew, he uses the phrase the Hebrew tongue. By contrast, when he means Aramaic, he says the language of our country, or our own language, or similar phrase. Here are some further examples. He also placed a partition around the temple, which in our tongue we call Gishon, but it is called Thrygios by the Greeks. Although I have so long accustomed myself to speak our own tongue that I cannot pronounce Greek. To translate those books into the Greek tongue which I formerly composed in the language of our country. But did Josephus really mean Aramaic when he says the language of our country? Is it still nevertheless possible that he meant Hebrew? Well, here is a verse from the New Testament, from the book of Acts, which settles the matter for once and all. Acts chapter 1, verse 19. And it was known unto all the dwellers at Jerusalem, insomuch as that field is called in their proper tongue Akeldama, that is to say, the field of blood. Here, after the death of Judas, the inhabitants of Jerusalem call the field where he died Akeldama. They call it Akeldama in their proper tongue, in other words, in their own tongue, that is, in the language in which the people of Jerusalem spoke. And so, if we can identify which language Akeldama is in, we can identify the language Josephus refers to as the language of our country and our own tongue. Josephus uses the same phrase, our own tongue, as opposed to the languages of the nations around them, the same phrase as the New Testament itself uses here in the book of Acts. So, in which language is Akeldama? Well, this phrase is made up from the Hebrew hakel, meaning field, and dama, meaning the blood. The King James is translated from Greek, and Greek has no letter H, and so hakel becomes akel when written in Greek. Just a note on grammar, the field of blood is in the construct state, where the word the goes with the second noun, i.e. literally in Aramaic it is field of the blood, whereas in English we would say the field of blood. But critically, Akeldama cannot be Hebrew. It can only be Aramaic. In Hebrew, the word for field is not hakel, it is sadeh. In Hebrew, the equivalent phrase would be sadeh hadam. Akeldama uniquely and precisely identifies our own tongue, the phrase used by both Josephus and the New Testament, as Aramaic rather than Hebrew. Aramaic was therefore the language generally spoken in first century Israel by Jews in Roman Judea. Both Josephus and the New Testament are in harmony. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall the matter be established. Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. We have seen then that Aramaic was the language of Josephus, the language of the New Testament, the language of Israel and Jerusalem, and therefore the language spoken by Jesus and the disciples. Aramaic should therefore command our respect. Aramaic should command our love. It is the holy language of the New Testament, just as Hebrew is the holy language of the Old Testament. If we love the Scriptures, we will love Aramaic, where the Scriptures were given in part in Aramaic. Studying Aramaic and the Aramaic background of the Holy Bible brings us back to a deeper, richer, and more authentic understanding of God's Word. We owe it to ourselves to understand Aramaic. Jesus spoke Aramaic, and we too should take the time to understand this wonderful language. Aramaic is an exciting journey into the world of Jesus, of Roman Judea, of the history of Israel, and of the New Testament. Make sure you study the other video lessons published at Jesus Spoke Aramaic to help you understand and appreciate the wonderful world of Aramaic and what it can offer you. This lesson is part of a series of lessons on the history and background of Aramaic.